Hi there, everybody. Well, I said I would come back if I had something to say, and I think that there is, well, we'll call it the elephant in the room and the new can of worms regarding autopilot. There's two big developments with the way autopilot, the investigation is going, and a lot of the things that I'm seeing online and talking to friends, and I think it's worth addressing both of these two things and consider what the ramifications are for Tesla going forward. So a little background, there are, as far as we know, 3 fatal autopilot accidents now, and I should say accidents that involve autopilot, because the system is not to blame, certainly, for everything. The first one was well publicized. It was, I think his name was Justin, a guy who ran under a tractor trailer here in the US, and allegedly, I don't know that they ever decided for sure, but may have been watching Harry Potter on a device or a laptop or something. Anyway, clear indication that he was not paying attention. The truck was making an illegal turn, but it just didn't matter that he went right under the truck and died. The second one, although I believe chronologically it actually happened earlier, was a driver in China who rear-ended some kind of roadwork truck, some kind of construction vehicle that was sitting in the far left lane on a highway. And again, indications are that he had plenty of time to react, great visibility, good conditions, and just drove into the back of the truck. So that's also clearly a driver attentiveness error. And then we have the most recent one, which was in California. An engineer for Apple was driving a blue Model X, and apparently the system likely took the Model X into a diverging section of the road and ran it head-on into a concrete barrier that had a crash attenuator that had not been reset for about a week and a half from the previous accident. So those are the 3 that we know of, and I'll get to the other things here just a minute. I got to do this merge. Okay, so in regards to those 3 crashes, I said that there was the elephant in the room and the new can of worms. The elephant in the room is that the most recent crash is very distinctive from the other 2. The other 2 were, as I understand it, both in clear conditions where the drivers had an abundance of time to react and did not. And I believe both of them involved speeds that were not legal for the road that they were on. Though I think the one from China is a little bit more suspect. Now, we're not seeing a lot of lawsuits or a lot of fallout from the various investigatory bodies, and I believe there is a lawsuit in China. Maybe it's filed in the US, I don't know, but I believe the family is pursuing full-time Tesla regarding the loss of their son. Of course, there's a lot of baggage in China. If you have one child and it happens to be the son and he happens to be of working age and all of that, which I believe this gentleman was, then they have, well, nothing but time on their hands to go after Tesla. However, having said that, I believe that the big difference in those 2 cases, and the reason why we don't hear much about them, is because the conditions were so good and the cars were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, which is to stay in their lane and follow traffic, as they're basically an augmented cruise control, and that they either didn't provide a warning, or even if they did provide a warning, the driver had all the time in the world to actually address the situation that was fast approaching them, and chose just deliberately not to. And we can get into lots of debate about whether or not the one in the US should have seen the tractor trailer crossing the road, or whether it mistook it as a billboard. The fact that the truck driver was making a turn without making sure there was time to clear the intersection. Or the one in China that, there was a stopped vehicle in a travel lane and the Tesla just came right up on it. Did it misread what that stopped truck was and somehow think it was, a bit of the infrastructure, like a bridge abutment or something, and that's why it didn't react? We know Teslas have an issue with stopped vehicles, and of course the truck crossing the road also would have looked a lot like a stopped vehicle to the camera, because relative motion, it would have been stationary. The difference between those 2 crashes and the one in California with the Apple engineer is that the systems were working well within their known limitations, and they were not doing, if anything, autopilot passively contributed to the crash, meaning that it had a driver that was being complacent, but the system itself didn't do anything to put the car in a position of crashing. It just followed a well-marked travel lane that happened to have an obstruction of some kind on it. And that resulted in those drivers' deaths, but they bear all of the responsibility for not having reacted when there was plenty of time to do so. The one in California, the new wrinkle on this is that the Model X in California actually deviated from what was the real road, and the car actively drove itself into the crash. Now, should the driver still have, all or some of the responsibility anytime a car on autopilot crashes? Well, we could debate about what is considered a reasonable amount of awareness, and there may be some other circumstances there that don't quite factor in. Like, I don't understand why the guy knew that it was a trouble spot, apparently, and this is according to the family now, which I think is going to affect their lawsuit potential. That he knew that this was a trouble area, but continued to try out the system. The thing is, with Tesla, there's an awful lot of people out there who will tell you, oh no, it's fleet learning, and the system continually improves the more cars that drive a particular route. So there actually is a reasonable expectation that the car would improve and behave differently on subsequent trips. So I can understand why, he would have been more apt to, I keep trying it every day when I go to work or coming home from work or whatever it was, because sooner or later it's going to get it. And as I understand it, many of the times it actually did do it. And so that this was kind of a fluke in that it didn't this particular time, which, it shouldn't be a crapshoot necessarily whether or not your car is going to actively try and crash. Anyway, so I want to point that out as kind of a difference. You can't really have it both ways and brag about fleet learning, but yet cars on autopilot probably today, 2+ weeks after the crash, can still go through that section of road and attempt to crash the barrier. I keep seeing videos on YouTube of people doing it. Well, there's not much evidence of fleet learning if that's the case, considering that only one Tesla has crashed into the barrier, but it's in one of the most Tesla-dense areas in the world. So the fleet learning thing, I think, is highly questionable at this point. As far as the car's improving over time, well, you can't tout that as a benefit of autopilot and the fundamentals of the system, and then blame this guy for continually trying to see if the system gets better. That kind of is the way people use autopilot, or Teslas in general, for that matter. The other thing about the hand warning, let's be honest. Everybody I've seen who has autopilot doesn't drive with both hands on the wheel all the time. Actually, I'm not doing it now myself, although I don't have autopilot. It's just a very boring section of road. And usually what I see people doing who have autopilot is they'll have hands off, and every now and then they'll see a little flash or something out of the corner of their eye that said, hey, the car tells them that they should have their hands on the wheel, and they'll put their hand there and give it a little wiggle, and as soon as the car is happy with that, then they drop their hands again and sit back and relax. Well, the jiggle and relax technique is something that has been kind of accepted, and I think accepted also by Tesla, and that leads me to the statement that they brought out very recently, where they really laid the blame at the foot of the driver, and it was a very harsh statement, and I'm really not happy with the way it was worded about, other people's families aren't on TV because their loved ones aren't dead. I mean, that, I get that Elon's maybe a little bit kind of in that Zuckerberg territory of not quite taking social cues real well, but that was really tone deaf. That was really not an attractive look for the company, and I hope that they back off of this really harsh stance sooner rather than later. Having said that, they mentioned in their statement that Tesla, something along the lines of Tesla requires, or autopilot requires, hands on the wheel. Well, it simply isn't true. You can very easily drive the car for long periods of time without putting your hands on the wheel, and there's no real enforcement of not having your hands on the wheel. Yeah, the warnings come up, but they're pretty easily defeated with this sort of jiggle and sit back and relax technique. So that's not really the same as requiring your hands to be on the wheel. Very different from other systems that I've seen tested, like from Cadillac, where they have a camera actively monitoring you. And I think there's some kind of sensor in the wheel that's different than Tesla. Tesla is somehow detecting, I think, torque on the steering column, which means it can be provided by anything, whether your hand or jiggling your key fob with a rubber band. Versus, I think the Cadillac system is maybe somehow detecting actual hand pressure on the wheel. Not really sure. Anyway, there definitely are different ways of doing it, and for them to say that Tesla requires that, or that autopilot requires that, that's a real stretch. Anyway, so that's the elephant in the room, is that this is the first crash of the 3 where the car actively drove itself into a position to cause the crash that resulted in death. And that is a distinction that I think is what will be brought up at trial. And you can say that the family is, not going to get anything, and that there's all this evidence and everything, and that may be true, right up until the moment that they face a jury. And you put a grieving widow with 2 young children there, who immigrated to the U.S., maybe doesn't have any marketable skills, maybe has, a lot of bills that need to be paid now that the only breadwinner in the family is gone, and she doesn't really have much choice but to sue. I mean, if he didn't have good life insurance, that may be the only way she can pay for her continued ability to live in this country, or live in the manner in which she expects to live. And I don't hold any ill will against somebody simply trying to maintain. Having said that, you put these people in front of a jury, and I think that it's not going to go well, and I really hope Tesla just makes a fair offer and makes that go away. Now that brings me to a whole other thing. There's a lot of folks that are like online talking about how, well, I know it's a beta system, and I use it responsibly. I'm not like those other people, so I'll never crash. And even if I did, I'm going to make sure it's in my will that nobody ever sues Tesla on my behalf, or I would happily sign a disclaimer saying that, if I die because of I was one of the beta testers of autonomous cars, then, I'll be one of the pioneers, like an astronaut in the early days of the space program, that's just blazing the trail and sacrificing my body for the sake of the greater good. That's all fine and dandy, and that's a really great hypothetical argument to tell yourself. Here's where the can of worms comes in. And you may detect a shade of Uber in this scenario. The can of worms comes in is how long, if ever, will it take for a car on autopilot, with or without an attentive driver is really irrelevant, for a car on autopilot to kill someone else. And that is a huge can of worms that, as far as I know, we haven't opened yet. And I feel that is where the real danger is, because those people are certainly not subscribing to the belief that they should be, the honored dead on the path to autonomous driving. They're just people who happen to get hit by a car that's driving itself to some degree or another by a driver who's maybe not paying attention, or maybe is paying attention and just reacts too late, and or a pedestrian for that matter. And how do we deal with those people? Because they didn't sign up to be sacrificed on that particular altar. And their survivors are most definitely going to sue Tesla. Doesn't matter what happens, that will be a lawsuit that will go against Tesla. And again, imagine that in front of a jury. Imagine that as a civil case in front of a jury trying to assign damages. It will not take very long for there to be numbers trotted around that are just eye-wateringly, staggeringly huge. Just think about that for a moment. All right, so I'm home now, and there's my beloved Blueberoo with its eyesight system. Not quite autopilot, but you get the idea if you know anything about the system. It's superb. Autopilot cheap, I guess you could say, because that car is less than half the cost of a Model 3, and all-wheel drive, and has a hatch. Now that you consider the possibility, just the possibility, the what if a car on autopilot kills an innocent person, a person not connected or affiliated with Tesla in any way. God forbid, somebody who's important. And by that, in the U.S., we generally mean the groups you think we might mean. We're talking about a family who are survivors that might have resources, or have resources provided for them. Because that will happen in that scenario. And they go to a civil court and they file a lawsuit seeking some kind of compensation for the death of their loved one who was just minding their own business, and a car killed them. It's just, I can't imagine the potential devastation. We're already looking at lots of ramifications. When I mentioned Uber, in regard to how their car hit the cyclist, also with an inattentive driver, by the way. But the cyclist was on a dark road in the middle of the night, crossing the street between the street lights, not on a crosswalk. I mean, there's a lot of variables in there that put some blame to that person as well. So we'll see how it turns out. But imagine a scenario without that, and I think you can see where my concern would be. So that's the can of worms we haven't opened yet, and I hope we don't open it. I don't want people to be killed by Teslas or in Teslas, obviously. And the elephant in the room is that this is the first crash, this recent one, where the car actively drove itself into a dangerous situation as opposed to passively following its programming, passively following the road and having a dangerous situation come across its path. It's a very, very different situation. So we'll see how that gets handled as well. Again, if it's a civil trial, it doesn't matter unless the jury's full of Tesla fanboys. That jury's going to see the weeping widow and consider her circumstances, consider the resources of the big company, and it's going to go the way it goes, and the way it typically goes. The other thing that's come out recently is that Tesla was working with the NTSB on their investigation, and there seems to be a dispute, at least at this particular moment, between whether or not Tesla stepped out of the investigation of the Model X crash or whether Tesla was excluded from the investigation and then said that they left. That'll all be out by the time I post this. I suspect it's going to be somewhere in the middle. But it doesn't matter. The end result is there appears to be animosity on both sides now with the way this investigation has been going. The NTSB can't do anything directly against Tesla. They're an advisory board. However, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration can kind of do whatever they want in regards to the deployment or non-deployment of these systems. And that goes back to what I mentioned in my first video about this crash, is that Tesla has so ingrained autopilot with their brand, at least in many people's minds, let's say, that rolling that back in any fashion is going to be just a huge stumbling block for the company. I think the cars are fabulous without autopilot. I love this car. I think it holds up very well. I recommend people never buy the full self-driving until it's actually, allowed by somebody, which so far nobody really seems to be weighing in on whether or not that's a legal thing. And this certainly isn't going to help, and that'll save you $5,000 or so. All I ever really wanted in this car was enhanced cruise control, and it wasn't available. Just the adaptive cruise control, I would have been happy with that. I got it on the Outback over there and love it. Eyesight is great, and for me, that's as far as I'm really interested in going personally. But if the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, comes back or gets a recommendation from the NTSB that there needs to be more controls over the drivers before they're allowed to do things, I don't know how you retrofit a fleet of a couple 100,000 cars now. Maybe a couple 100,000 is kind of on the line of about where the autopilot cars are, because we've got to figure there's somewhere, it's maybe 2/3 of that, and I think my car has been in the 40,000s, and I think that autopilot was starting to be built into cars somewhere in the high 50s, and of course all the X's have it, all the 3s have it. But you're still talking about a lot of cars, and is Tesla really going to go and retrofit, if they even could, driver-facing cameras or different monitoring systems on the steering wheel? And what does that look like? It's not a warranty repair, but on the same hand, you paid for a particular function that now you don't have, so you feel like you should get money back, or they somehow make the car able to do that. And there's been conflicting statements about Tesla saying that they would upgrade cars with the hardware necessary to do full self-driving if they didn't have it when they were built and you paid for the feature. All right, well, that's not the same as upgrading cars to maintain the current level of semi-autonomous, semi-adaptive cruise, whatever it is, whatever you want to call it, whatever the current autopilot is. I don't think there's any language that's been issued by Tesla to suggest that they would give you hardware upgrades and modifications necessary to maintain what you've already got if the regulations were changed. Now, there is language that says if the regulations are changed, then, whoop, sucks to be you, and Tesla's not responsible for that, and you take it up with your local representatives, which is very convenient, and that's how I would have phrased it too, given the potential. But that doesn't make for a very happy owner base if all of a sudden you have all these owners who have been using autopilot and enjoying it, not able to. So there's a lot of things right now. I seem to be in the minority of my group of Tesla owners, in that I'm quite concerned about what this means for the future of the company, this one particular crash. And then if we were to have that other scenario, who knows? So we will see how it pans out. But those are just some things I wanted to throw out there that I I haven't seen a lot of people really digesting. I feel that there's a lot of fanboyism, and we need to be realistic about how this process works, and that not everybody is on board with the future that Tesla envisions necessarily at what the potential cost may be to get there. And so that's all I had to say. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you want to catch more of my rants or semi-informed diatribes, I guess I could call them. And thank you for watching. Bye.